optimistic that the deal prevents a further escalation. But now questions are being raised about how much it really does for global growth. In Nigeria, Dangote Cement and MTN are topping the gainers list, both up over 2% on the day. Now, also coming up on the show, South African Airways now headed for imminent collapse. Egypt's central bank cuts its lending rates. And the EU chief dashes hopes of a comprehensive trade deal with the UK within a year. Well, let's start off today's show in South Africa, where embattled national carrier South African Airways seems to be in its death throes. In the strongest indication that the airline could soon cease to exist, South African Airways has put 9 of its airplanes worth over $2.5 billion up for sale. Now, according to reports, the carrier is selling its Airbus A340-300s and A340-600s, as well as 15 spare engines. Last month, SAA entered a form of bankruptcy protection. This was in a bid to rescue the company and 10,000 related jobs. At the time, it was promised about $139 million from the government and a similar amount from its lenders. But while the lenders have paid up, South Africa's treasury is yet to provide its portion of those funds. Well, Sumitra Naidu now joins us in Johannesburg with more insight into this. Sumitra, always great to have you on the show. Now, last we heard from South Africa's Finance Minister, Tito Mboweni, the government is basically still trying to find additional financing for the airline. What do we know so far about the government's ability to come up with the cash now? Is it hopeful?
Well, Uche, it's looking rather bleak at this stage. It is a desperate situation, and it looks like no one is budging. No one is interested in loaning money to the airline. So as you said, you know, the business rescue practitioners actually requested 4 billion rand. They did manage to get 2 billion rand from private lenders. The other 2 billion was promised by government. Unfortunately, we didn't get much more detail or information from the finance minister on how far government is in terms of coming up with the money. The finance minister said there were still attempts being made to find that money. But if you remember last year, Tito Mboweni did say that there won't be any more money for SAA. But this is not just a case of we won't give you any more money. There just isn't any money in the fiscus to give. So you never know. We may get a surprise announcement in the next day or two because the government doesn't want to let this airline go. Plus, there's around 10,000 jobs at stake. Obviously, it doesn't want to find itself in that situation, having to deal with the unions and all of these job losses, especially with unemployment sitting at over 29%. Uche?
All right, Sumitra, and of course the situation is quite critical because some are now warning that if the state doesn't come up with that money, the airline could become insolvent. However, we have heard from the business rescue practitioners. They say liquidation isn't on the table. So what happens next with the airline, Sumitra?
Yeah, you know, the business rescue practitioners say they're still hopeful that the money will come through and they don't think liquidation is the route to take. But that is the big question, Uche. What if they don't get the money? There may be no other option left. Some union officials are warning that SAA will again be forced to start suspending flights and delay paying salaries this month. But it's not clear at this stage. Some economists say the other option would be to find a buyer, maybe a consortium that's willing to take on the airline and its debt. But again, we know that government has never wanted to go the privatization route, so we're not clear on whether that may actually become an option at all.
Well, just stay with us, Sumitra, as we move on to another top story coming out of South Africa today. Now, the Reserve Bank's Monetary Policy Committee has reduced the repo rate to 6.25%. As a result of that cut, the prime rate now falls to 9.75%. The repo rate is the benchmark interest rate at which the central bank lends money to commercial banks. The last time South Africa saw a drop in the lending rate was last July, when of course it was reduced by 25 basis points to 6.5%. In the meantime, the Apex Bank projects that South Africa's GDP will only expand by 0.4% in 2019. It has also downgraded growth outlooks for 2020 and 2021 to 1.2% and 1.6% respectively.
The MPC assesses the risks to the growth forecast to be on the downside. Escalation in global trade tensions, geopolitical risks, further domestic supply constraints, and/or sustained higher oil prices could generate headwinds to growth. Public sector financing needs have risen, increasing risk premiums and pushing borrowing costs for the broader economy higher. Implementation of prudent macroeconomic policies and structural reforms that lower costs and increase investment, potential growth and job creation remains urgent.
Well, let's go back to Sumitra now for more insight into that decision. Sumitra, of course, today's decision was mostly unexpected by analysts, but of course that ongoing trend of below expectation inflation numbers did support an interest rate cut. So what was the tone behind today's decision from the MPC?
Yeah, considering there was a cut, you would be a little bit upbeat, but the governor was still slightly hawkish. And you don't blame him. There's just so much going on here and abroad. But the lower inflation rate and the stronger rand certainly made a very strong case for the rate cut, and which many economists say was long overdue. Inflation has been steadily declining since early last year. Food inflation has eased significantly and is actually responsible for the bulk of the decline in that overall price basket. There's also been lower credit extension numbers coming out. Consumers are very constrained. They're under a lot of pressure. There's not a lot of spending happening. There's not a lot of borrowing happening. The economy is really staggering along. The Reserve Bank has always preferred to stay cautious and conservative. Some would say, it was really concerned last year about domestic challenges like growing debt, low growth, and the impact of Eskom, as well as, geopolitical concerns. But I think the bank found itself in a position that it just couldn't avoid any longer, especially with record low inflation. I mean, we've got inflation now sitting at 3.5%. The governor also reflected on the massive gain in the rand. In November, at the time of the last MPC meeting, it was trading at near 15 rand against the dollar. And it just, in the last couple of weeks, it's been trading at an average of around a 14.25, 14.30 against the dollar. So those are considerable gains, and imports are very important for South Africa. It does ease the pressure there. And of course, the Reserve Bank felt that, it was time to offer some relief, which it could have actually done last year, but decided to wait. So it was a bit of a surprise coming through, but, the governor is still very concerned.
Right. Well, some would actually say that today's decision to cut rates did take some pressure off the Reserve Bank. Of course, the bank has been facing some heat from the ruling party, the ANC. They say it should be doing more to boost growth and help reduce unemployment in the country. So how much pressure is Kganyago facing right now? And is the bank's mandate and independence still in question?
Yeah, I think he is facing a lot of pressure from many sides. So it's also, many economists were also quite disappointed at the last MPC meeting that he didn't cut rates. So, you're just looking at the numbers, there was definitely a room to cut rates. But the bank made itself very clear that it will not bow down to any pressure. It will remain independent and do what it's mandated to do, and that is essentially to maintain price stability. Again, the governor warned that structural reforms needed to be implemented urgently. The bank also lowered its growth forecast for this year down to 0.4% and, lowered the forecast for the next 2 years as well, and went further to warn that there were more headwinds for the economy. So, considering that the public protector lost her case to actually change to have the constitution changed in order to change the mandate of the Reserve Bank, to incorporate more growth into that mandate. Considering that she lost that case, there are still rumblings around that kind of pressure is still there, and there's still many that want the constitution changed in order for the Reserve Bank to do that. There's also a debate around the nationalization of the Reserve Bank, even though that law has been passed and it's going to happen pretty soon. The Reserve Bank governor is just not stepping back. He said he will fight it head on. It needs to remain independent, even if it's not, and if it goes into the hands of the state, it will still be independent. It will run independently. But in terms of doing much more with the interest rates, he's not bowing down to any pressure. He's really looking at the numbers here. Uche?
Well, we're certainly watching. Many thanks, Sumitra, for those insights. Sumitra Naidu joining us there in Johannesburg. Well, let's stay in South Africa. The country has hosted a pre-World Economic Forum breakfast in Johannesburg. The gathering served as a preparatory engagement for Team South Africa ahead of their departure to Davos, Switzerland, of course, for the 50th annual World Economic Forum meeting. Now, the delegation is led by President Cyril Ramaphosa and will be coordinated by Finance Minister Tito Mboweni. Here's CGTN's Angelo Coppola with more.
While the Davos meeting is not about signing deals and reaching agreements, potential and current investors have questions they want answers to concerning the South African economy.
I think the conversation will proceed about the progress we're making in stabilizing Eskom. That is going to happen, and I think we'll prepare that. And then there'll be questions about how far we're moving with structural reforms. There'll be questions about other state-owned enterprises. There'll be questions about the investment climate. And we'll be able to answer those questions.
A large business delegation will be going to Davos again in 2020, and they are aware of the challenges the country faces.
But if I look at it in the medium term, I think we've got to take those tough decisions that they speak to in order to get to the outcomes that we require. If we don't, we lose credibility, and I'm hoping this year we'll continue to speak about the truth, as Minister Mboweni says, and get to the substance of what we have to do.
South Africa does, however, have the benefit of being part of the African Continental Free Trade Area and the positive spin-offs that this will provide.
We expect the first tariff liberalization to commence in July this year, and we are now working also, very importantly, on a services pact in the AfCFTA, looking at a range of services from telecoms to finance and others, so that our companies that operate elsewhere in the continent can do so on the basis of agreed rules and on the basis of a commitment to market access, to opening up markets.
It seems like South Africa has more challenges than it had last year at this time when Davos took place. And the minister and all the delegation that are going there are going to have one single message, that things are changing and they're moving ahead, and investors should get interested. I'm Angelo Coppola for CGTN in Johannesburg, South Africa.
Well, let's move on now. The Monetary Union of West Africa has agreed with France to rename its CFA franc currency to the ECO. Now, this move will assist in cutting financial links with Paris, which have underpinned the region's common currency since its creation. Under the terms, the ECO will remain pegged to the euro. However, African states will not be required to deposit 50% of their reserves at the Treasury in France. In addition, there will no longer be a French representative on the currency's union board. Critics have long viewed the CFA as a relic from colonial times. Proponents, on the other hand, say it has provided financial stability in a sometimes turbulent region. Now, the currency is used in about 14 African nations. They have a combined population of an estimated 150 million and GDP of $235 billion US. Let's now take a look at our corporate headlines today. Ethiopia's state telecoms monopoly, Ethio Telecom, has reported a 32% rise in its first half earnings. Revenue increased to $693 million during the 6-month period. The number of mobile subscribers also rose to about 44 million. That's an increase of around 10.9% compared to 2018. Now, last year, the Ethiopian government disclosed plans to privatize parts of Ethio Telecom. Several world operators have since shown interest in this largely untapped market. And South Africa's biggest fixed-line operator, Telkom, says it will cut up to 3,000 jobs. The firm will consider voluntary severance and early retirement packages for workers who are affected by phase 1 of these job cuts. Like other African telecoms firms, Telkom is currently trying to keep pace with the demand for the internet and data. However, the carrier is still struggling with declining performance in its fixed voice and data services. And elsewhere, clothing retailer Truworths has reported a 1.2% growth in its half-year sales. In the 26-week period ending in December 2019, Truworths says its African segment, mainly comprised of South African operations, rose by about 2.7%. Its UK-based office chain, on the other hand, fell by 3.3% in the period to stand at roughly $197 million. The South African listed retailer attributes the decline to Brexit uncertainty combined with continued pressure on store-based retailing. Meanwhile, Amazon.com CEO Jeff Bezos says on Wednesday his company will invest $1 billion to bring small businesses online in India. He was reaching out to some of his fiercest critics during a goodwill visit. Amazon and Walmart's Flipkart have been hit with a barrage of criticism from a conference of 70 of India's brick-and-mortar retailers. They accuse the US giants of violating Indian law with deep discounts. Of course, the companies deny those allegations. The investment of $1 billion will certainly help bring more than 10 million Indian businesses online and, of course, enable exports of Indian-made goods worth about $10 billion by 2025. And that's a look at our corporate headlines. Now we're heading into a short break, but still to come. Egypt's central bank expected to cut its lending rates. And Ethiopia, Egypt, and Sudan reach an agreement over the Grand Renaissance Dam.
The world economy as we know it is about to change. Global business reports highlight emerging markets, developing countries, and dynamic sectors worldwide. We feature top analysts and newsmakers to provide perspectives on every facet of business. From an on-the-ground perspective, we provide you with balanced and objective assessments. Fast, sharp, and insightful. Global business, only on CGTN.
Every story starts out like this.
Okay. We'll head up now.
But beyond the rush of the numbers, there's always a more fundamental question. What happened? Who has been affected? When market-moving decisions are made, who's responsible and why?
Let's get some reaction on ground. Joining us in Johannesburg is Sutra. Hello, Naro.
This is how all stories begin. See how they end. Only on Global Business.
Global leaders are meeting in Davos for the 2020 World Economic Forum. Their mission to set the year's agenda and ask the toughest questions, from resolving trade tensions to tackling climate change. Join us on CGTN for special coverage.
Welcome back. Now, the Central Bank of Egypt may consider cutting the interest rates for the fourth consecutive time. Egypt's Monetary Policy Committee is meeting in Cairo, and analysts say the rate cut is expected despite a 7.1% rise in inflation in December. Inflation had dropped to 3.1% in October, marking the lowest rate since December 2005. The Reserve Bank cut rates by a combined 350 basis points during the last 3 consecutive meetings and 100 basis points in February 2019. Now, the current rates stand at 12.25% for deposit and 13.25% for the lending rate. Well, let's find out more about today's decision from CGTN's Yasser Hakim. He joins us now in Cairo. Yasser, it's always great to have you on the show. Now, the consensus right now seems to be that there is enough room for the CBE to proceed with monetary easing this year. What sort of tone is coming from the committee?
Well, so far we have no news. It's been a long meeting. We're into the third hour. They usually don't stay that long in their meetings. However, we expect, because this is the first meeting for the new year with a new board that has just been established to begin a new term for the CBE under the same governor, Tariq Amir. So I think there might have been some other issues to be discussed, being the first meeting by the group, a new group of board members in the CBE. So we're still waiting for any results coming out from the committee. However, like you said, yes, the trend is towards easing again the rates. The Egyptian pound has been strong in the last 6 months against the US dollar, increased by over 10%. There's a revenue of foreign currency coming into the country, about 1.7 billion in just 1 week. So this has all strengthened the Egyptian pound and strengthened the fiscal policy, and therefore could make it easier for the central bank to take the decision to cut rates on Thursday night, or at least keep it as it is if the central bank wants to remain things as it is. You know, in the tensions in the region right now, maybe a fear of businesses or businessmen taking their money out of the T-bills and the bonds with the tensions in the region. So he might keep it, but the overall tendency is that we could expect a cut rates very soon.
Right, but as we wait for that decision, Yasser, let's touch a bit on inflation going forward. Now, we did see the headline inflation rate double in December. It hit about 7.1%. Some experts say that it is expected to moderate this year. What is the outlook given the fundamentals?
Yes, it may have doubled, but it's still below the expectations that have been put by the central bank. The central bank has expected it to reach 9%, so 7.1% is still good. And according to the forecast for the year, we're talking from 6 to 7% headline inflation. So the numbers are welcomed by the central bank and the financial sector here, and it looks like it's going to be a stable year for 2020.
Now, of course, it is highly likely that we will see a cut coming out of today's MPC meeting, and that certainly will be good for the government. It'll certainly ensure that the government will be more flexible when it comes to fiscal matters, as you mentioned. But what does a cut in rates, Yasser, mean for the private sector in Egypt and, of course, investors going forward?
The thing is, yes, the higher interest rates have been good for the Egyptian pound and also has helped in balancing a bit the flotation of the Egyptian pound in the last 2 years. However, for investors, it's not good because higher interest rates means tougher to get loans. It's going to be more expensive to get loans in the last couple of years, and even this has limited the scope for businessmen and investors to either establish new investments or to grow or expand in the market, get loans and expand and grow and increase production, for example. So this has been limited because of the high interest rates. So easing the rates will help investors, encourage investors to put more money into the market. into production, and for the current investors to increase and expand their output and expand their businesses. So obviously the business community is waiting for more cuts in the next in this committee and the next few months as well, to try to encourage for more investments in the country.
Now, Yasser, shifting focus slightly, Egypt did just complete what some would say was a successful economic reform program, of course supported by an extended fund facility with the IMF. It is actually about to start a new round of talks or negotiations with the IMF, it says, to discuss further cooperation. Are there any updates as to what exactly that will entail?
Now, the government started by saying that this cooperation will be away from any loans. So it's just technical cooperation, advice and following up on the economic reforms that has been undergone concerning the $12 billion loan, 3-year $12 billion loan. So it's just a follow-up on it and a continuation of this program that has been a success for the Egyptian government. But around a couple of months ago, the Minister of Finance said that there might be a talk of a new loan. He did not mention the amount or the duration of the loan, but he said that there might be. It's not confirmed yet since then if it will be a new loan or just a continuation of the economic reform plan. So we're still waiting for updates on this and to see if the next meeting will come up with a new loan or just a continuation of the economic reform plans that have been successful in the last 3 years.
Well, Yasser, I know you're standing by for that MPC decision. Many thanks for joining us on the show today. Of course, that's Yasser Hakim joining us there in Cairo. Now, ministers from Egypt, Ethiopia and Sudan have agreed to reconvene later this month to finalize an agreement on the Nile Dam project. The deal was reached in Washington after talks brokered by the U.S. Our correspondent in Cairo, Adel El Marhoui, has more.
Despite an ultimatum to reach an agreement by mid-January, Egypt, Ethiopia and Sudan say they need more time. A new deadline to reach a final deal has been set to January 29 after a final meeting in Washington, D.C.
The final round of the U.S. talks comes after the Ethiopian Prime Minister asked South Africa to mediate in the Nile talks, which was clear that this round in Washington would not reach any concrete agreement, because Ethiopia appears to be already planning for their next move. Unfortunately, the process is being lengthened, which frustrates Egypt because the filling is expected in July.
After 3 days of intensive talks in the U.S. capital, some progress have been made. The countries have agreed on the principles that should strike a deal. Ethiopia should be committed to fill the dam's reservoir during the rainy season. That concept should be adaptable during cases of extreme drought, according to a statement from the U.S. Treasury, which hosted the talks.
Egypt wants an agreement on operation and filling of the dam, which doesn't cause any harm on Egyptian water security during the coming years. They also want prior agreement before Ethiopia begins to build any water construction or barriers over the Nile, because Egypt depends mainly on the Nile for water.
During the operation of the Ethiopia Dam, water released in the Nile stream should follow a mechanism based on the hydrological state of the Blue Nile to minimize the impact on the downstream Niles, Egypt and Sudan. The 3 countries should also agree in the next 2 weeks on a method to resolve disputes between them regarding the dam's operation.
After 3 days of continuous negotiations, the 3 countries have only agreed on the principles to reach an agreement. But the details of implementation have always been the obstacles for a deal between these 3 countries. At least 2 more meetings will be held during the next 2 weeks. Both technical and political meetings will still be attended by the United States and the World Bank. Adel El Marhoui, CGTN, Cairo.
Now, those talks on the Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, which were held in Washington, D.C., did conclude with a preliminary agreement. Ethiopians are now cautiously optimistic about the deal. Here's CGTN's Gerum Chala with more.
After the Washington talks between Ethiopia, Egypt and Sudan, foreign and water ministers in the presence of the U.S. government and World Bank representatives, many Ethiopians are now cautiously optimistic about the future. Some say the preliminary agreement of considering a comprehensive, cooperative, adaptive, sustainable and mutually beneficial agreement on the filling and operation of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam is something taken positively here. According to the joint communique, the filling of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam will be executed in states and will be undertaken in an adaptive and cooperative manner that takes into consideration the hydrological conditions of the Blue Nile and the potential impact of the filling on the downstream reservoirs. And it says a filling will take place during the wet season, January from July to August, and will continue in September subject to certain conditions. But the above preliminary agreement is unclear for most people here, and some even fear the U.S. might impose mutually unacceptable measures which could affect Ethiopia's interests. Gerum Chala, CGTN, Addis Ababa, Ethiopia.
Moving on now, British oil and gas firm Tullow has suspended the trucking of Kenya's crude from Turkana to Mombasa. The exercise will remain suspended until sections of roads which are severely damaged by heavy rains are finally repaired. Tullow uses a fleet of 100 specialized tankers to lift about 2,000 barrels per day over the 1,000 kilometers. The suspension derails the Ministry of Petroleum's shipment target of 500,000 barrels of oil. Now, this will have a direct impact on Tullow, which expects to report a $1.5 billion write-down. This is after lowering its long-term oil price assumption by $10 to $65 a barrel. Now, between 2010 and 2012, a wide range of private equity funds, including the now fallen fund, Abraj, to others like Helios, Mediterranean Capital and others, raised about $6.5 billion for investment across the continent. Between 2010 and 2015, 17% of Africa-focused private equity investments were in East Africa, including Ethiopia. West Africa accounted for about a quarter of total deals, and South Africa took in 24% of the total. Now, nearly 60% of private equity deals in East Africa have taken place in Kenya in the 5 years to 2018, with Ethiopia taking only 7%. But with the new government keen on welcoming foreign capital and wide-ranging economic reforms, the country of 100 million is regarded as a key growth market. Secondary exits have been the preferred exit route for East Africa-focused private equity funds. Of the 44 exits between 2007 and 2018, the majority were through sales to strategic investors. 22% were sales to other financial investors, and a roughly similar proportion were through share buybacks. IPOs accounted for barely 7% of the total. Now, the median gross internal rate of return over that decade was 20% against a target of 23%. That's according to industry data. Now, earlier, CGTN's Ramanyang explored the outlook for private equity in East Africa in 2020. He started his conversation by exploring industry perceptions of Ethiopia.
For the East Africa bloc, Ethiopia is one of those markets that offers the most exciting opportunities, and predominantly because of its large population and offering a very ready market, and also the pace of industrialization. They have been sort of among the leaders in the region in industrialization and promoting agro-processing and other value chain industries. So in that regard, we've seen quite the growth of interest in Ethiopia. The other thing that has been interesting about Ethiopia is because of the dynamics of the market sort of not being very attached to the rest of the East Africa community, we've seen the growth of local funds. So we have about 3 predominantly Ethiopia-focused country private equity firms, Zoskale, CFS Capital, and them that are locally led and are investing in the market, and because of that we anticipate to get a lot more deals from that market going forward, because these are people who are based there, they've raised money to specifically invest there, and they know
understand the local culture.
Yes, they understand the nuances of the market. So for instance, in 2019 we had about 4 deals done out of Ethiopia. 3 of those were in manufacturing, 1 was in TMT, technology, media and telecommunication.
The thing about Ethiopia's economy is that yes, it's large. You've got about 100 million people there, and it has been growing relatively quickly, 6% if you take the World Bank's forecast for this year at face value, but there's still some deep fundamental problems there. So currency, for example, there's been a serious shortage of foreign currency in the country. And yes, PE operates on this 7 to 10 year cycle, but are we at a point where we can legitimately say that private equity firms can look at those macro risks and say, yeah, we're willing to take this risk for the long haul?
That's why it needs a local to do the investments in that country, just because they understand how to navigate around that. And to give credit where it's due, they have tried, at least for us in private equity, we're seeing some considerations to collaborate with private capital from the government side and meet them at some sort of middle point where we can be able to transact and promote the economic development of Ethiopia.
Right. A final question. Exits in this market. I know this has been a long-standing stick issue, especially with PE over the last decade, because the standard model elsewhere is take a company, buy into a company, essentially list it at some point, exit, get your cash. Here the model is usually slightly different. It's either you cash out to a bigger firm or you cash out to another DFI. Yeah. Has that changed? Might 2020 be the year that starts to change? Because we haven't seen listings coming through on the Nairobi Securities Exchange.
Yeah. And I don't know if listing is going to be the automatic exit route for East African private equity, but I will say...
And it isn't the preferred route either.
Yeah, globally, I think even as the markets develop across the world, we're seeing less of the listings and more strategic buys. So Centum exited Almasi to Coca-Cola, for instance, and some of those provide more opportunities for the business to grow, tap into Coca-Cola's asset in the case of Almasi. And in our instance, and speaking to the exit environment to East Africa, a lot of the deals that were done in the last 10 years were done by funds that were set up or with a vintage year of 2011, which means they're just coming out of Fund 1, and this is when we now start to realize the exits. If we look at 2019, for instance, we had about 2 deals from Fanisi Capital. They exited Haltons, they exited Hillcrest, and that's a fund whose Fund 1 was around 2011. And so we're likely to see more of those as the funds set up around 7 years ago start to mature and get into their Fund 2 and follow-on funds. And the market is ready. We're getting a lot more interest from strategic buyers. And there's also push for consolidation of certain segments. If you look at the investment Adenia made into Tumaini first, and then they bought out Quickmart, it speaks to the...
Especially on the retail side,
exactly,
because that's one of the more interesting planes in the market.
Precisely. Hillcrest was exited to GEMS, which is a big school or education institution.
You are watching Global Business Africa. Let's take a quick break now, still to come. The EU chief dashes hopes of a comprehensive trade deal with the UK within a year. And a US tech firm develops a solar system to produce water for arid areas.
Holding guns. Machine guns from police forces toward the protesters.
Were you worried about your life at that particular time? Not at all.
What is your assessment of the state of the continent today?
Africa has the potential to power itself.
Excuse me.
here's a recap of today's top headlines. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan says Ankara has started sending troops to Libya. This follows a failed peace talks in Moscow between Libya's warring factions. Erdogan says Turkey will use diplomatic and military means to help ensure stability. He also added that Ankara will start granting licenses within the year for exploration and drilling in the eastern Mediterranean. That's after signing a maritime agreement with Libya. And in South Sudan, President Salva Kiir and opposition leader Riek Machar have agreed to form a unity government by next month, but there is still no agreement on the boundaries or the number of states in the country. The issue of the total number of states and their boundaries remains a sticking point in South Sudan's peace process. The opposition, led by Riek Machar, wants the number reduced, saying it's being used by President Salva Kiir to give jobs to his loyalists and seek support to stay longer in office. And the EU's top diplomat, Josep Borrell, says he held frank, direct talks with Iran's foreign minister, Mohammad Javad Zarif, in New Delhi on Thursday. The EU says it pressed Tehran to preserve the increasingly fragile nuclear deal. This comes after Britain, France, and Germany formally accused Tehran of breaking the 2015 nuclear arms control agreement. Iran accused European governments Thursday of sacrificing the deal after US President Donald Trump threatened them with higher car export tariffs. And that's a recap of today's top headlines. Now, on the international front, the European Union's top official, Ursula von der Leyen, has said the bloc is ready to work round the clock to reach a post-Brexit trade deal with Britain. The European Commission chief, while on a visit to Ireland, said formal talks will begin at the end of February or early March. Von der Leyen has, however, warned that it will be impossible to get a comprehensive free trade agreement negotiated in less than a year. Prime Minister Boris Johnson has until July 1st to ask for more time, but has vowed not to prolong the process further. The overarching theme of the talks will look at how closely Britain remains aligned to EU rules and regulations after Brexit. Now, currently, the EU primarily exports goods to Britain and imports UK services.
We have a wide agenda. And therefore, we will start negotiating the moment the mandate is there in parallel different topics. But if we look at the timetable, net we do have around 8 months. And as I said, it's not only trade. There are a lot of other topics too that have to be negotiated. Just if you think of the security topic, for example, or research, innovation, the universities, Erasmus. So the strands will go in parallel.
It's our desire that it should be an agreement in which there's no quotas, no taxes, the minimum checks and administration necessary, but there also has to be a level playing field so that the single market and the customs union are not diluted, and that we must have common minimum standards so that the UK doesn't attempt in any way to undercut the EU when it comes to labour standards, environmental standards, health and safety, product standards.
And of course, China and the US signed phase 1 of an agreement that will begin to ease the trade war between the two economic powers. Chinese Vice Premier Liu He and US President Donald Trump signed the agreement at the White House on Wednesday. Now, Trump said the deal was, in quotes, righting the wrongs of the past. He said it will deliver economic justice for American workers. Wang Xinwen has those details.
All eyes on Washington. Chinese Vice Premier Liu He and U.S. President Donald Trump signed the Phase 1 agreement, easing the long-running trade war between the world's two largest economic powers.
China will work with the U.S., act in the principle of equality and mutual respect, strictly honor the agreement, accommodate each other's core concerns, and ensure the good implementation of the Phase 1 trade agreement. It is the pressing need and will also play an important role in the growth of bilateral economic and trade relations in the future.
We are going to work together, and we're going to work together for the benefit of our countries, but also, very importantly, for the benefit of the world. So this is a very big day for the United States. It's a very big day for China. This is a day that nobody thought could happen.
85 pages long, officially called the Economic and Trade Agreement between the Government of the People's Republic of China and the Government of the United States of America. China will buy $200 billion worth of American products and services, covering agriculture, manufacturing, the services industry, as well as energy over 2 years. Some tariffs on Chinese goods are reduced, like Chinese-made cell phones, toys, and laptop computers. Others maintained.
We're negotiating with the tariffs. We have 25% on $250 billion worth of goods, and then we're bringing the 10% down to 7.5% on $300 billion worth of goods plus. But I'm leaving them on because otherwise we have no cards to negotiate with, and negotiating with Leo is very tough.
Investors relieved. Keyword stock market indexes climbed to record highs after the deal was signed. And the Chinese Vice Premier Liu He met the press.
There were arguments, but we respect and cooperate with each other as well. We both have clear goals to eventually reach an agreement on the basis of the interests of the two nations' peoples. I think this is the result of a rational negotiation, and this rationality deserves to be promoted.
There are still concerns that thorny trade issues are still unresolved, and Trump says tariffs will come off after Phase 2 is finished. A phase which has yet to begin. Wang Sun, CGTN.
Now, the signing of that Phase 1 deal will certainly help boost confidence in the stable growth of the world economy. Not only will the leading economies benefit from the agreement, but long-standing partners in Africa like Egypt will also benefit. The agreement upholds diplomatic concepts that the Chinese government has for long championed to resolve differences between countries through equal dialogue and negotiation.
As we all know, many countries have suffered losses in the Sino-US trade war. As a result, world trade has shrunk in a past period of time, and the signing of this agreement will serve to curb the shrinking of world trade. The scale of world trade has shrunk severely in the past. Let's take the Suez Canal in Egypt as an example. Without the Sino-US trade war, the canal income will definitely be better. Therefore, the signing of this agreement will undoubtedly have a huge positive impact on the slowing world economic growth. China has always maintained that negotiation is the best way to resolve the differences between countries, and China's basic principle is not to seek any form of confrontation and conflict. China has always practiced negotiating ways to eliminate differences between nations, and multilateralism has always been a firm stand of the Chinese government.
And moving on now, South Korean car maker Hyundai has launched its first luxury SUV. This comes as the country's economy remains sluggish, largely due to the ongoing trade spat between China and the US. But Hyundai's future isn't solely influenced by the resolution of the trade war. As Joseph Kim reports, it now depends on how the company invests in the near to long-term future.
It's South Korea's first luxury SUV. Hyundai Motors unveiled its push into the sector under its Genesis brand in Seoul. It's part of the company's aim to expand the company's presence and image in overseas markets.
This is another new beginning for us, and at the same time, an even greater challenge. Made by our own very hands, we will take Korean luxury into uncharted territory with pride and with confidence, walk forward into the global market.
The latest launch is part of the automaker's efforts to bounce back after several tumultuous years. In 2019, Hyundai and its affiliate Kia Motors turned in their lowest sales in 7 years. But while South Korea's export-reliant economy has been feeling the weight of the global economic slowdown, driven in part by the trade dispute between China and the United States, analysts argue its downturn resulted from the company's slow jump to future investments and R&D. So expectations aren't riding on the signing of the Phase 1 trade deal, but rather the company's plans for the future.
Although political matters have some influence, the most important part is to change their cars to earn love from consumers. And with new models lined up like new energy vehicles, it's expected that Hyundai will see some recovery.
With the launch of new flagship models, including luxurious SUVs and electric cars, Hyundai is trying to catch up to meet consumer demands. The South Korean automaker expects that this will help combined sales rise 5% in 2020. However, this aggressive sales target far exceeds the forecasted growth in the global market. There are still some bright spots ahead. During the launch, Hyundai teased several new upcoming models consumers can look forward to. And with this big push, Hyundai and South Korea's auto industry as a whole will hope to keep rolling into the future. Joseph Kim for CGTN, Koyang, South Korea.
Meanwhile, a U.S. tech firm is harnessing the power of the sun to produce renewable and potable drinking water, which it aims will bring relief to millions of people living in water-scarce regions around the world. Now, the company called Zero Mass Water showcased its innovation at this year's Consumer Electronics Show in the U.S.
The World Resources Institute says a quarter of the world's people are close to facing dangerous water shortages, with 17 countries facing extremely high water stress. This is a situation worsened by more frequent shocks tied to climate change, especially in the largely dry regions. The founder of Zero Mass Water Company seeks to exploit the advantage in the adverse challenge.
We take sunlight and air and produce pure water. It is then mineralized, stored, and then delivered at basically any volume that's needed by that home, a school, that hotel, or a whole community.
The solar-powered hydro panels contain a hygroscopic material that absorbs the water in the air.
Source uses sunlight and air to make pure water by taking hygroscopic materials that passively absorb water from the atmosphere, concentrate it by about 20,000 times by volume, and then we use sunlight to respire that water vapor back off those materials to produce pure water, independent of where we are on the planet.
Each individual hydro panel can produce up to 300 standard half-a-liter bottle of water per month. The panels are ideal for arid, low-humidity environments like dry Middle East and North Africa regions, among others.
Whether it's a high-end home in LA that's drinking a lot of bottled water, or it's the Samburu Girls Foundation, where girls are walking 2 miles a day to get their water historically. That whole spectrum of humanity, ranging from the people who have a lot to the people who have a lot less. The water solution is now the exact same. We really have created a global water source that is effectively a well that we can establish anywhere on the planet and solve people's water challenges immediately.
The company already has its source panels in 36 countries and hopes to expand its manufacturing numbers from its current 10,000 panels a year to 100,000. The source Rexy panels will sell for $2,500. Beryl Oro, CGTN.
And moving on now, here's a look at how commodities performed today. Oil prices rising today after the US and China signed that eagerly awaited Phase 1 trade deal. That gave some relief to markets today, but of course gains were capped as the International Energy Agency said it expected oil production to outstrip demand this year. Meanwhile, gold continues to hold steady today as investors worry that a number of sore issues remained unresolved between, of course, the world's two top economies. Let's take a short break now. Still to come. A Nigerian engineer develops a water-powered electricity generator.
You don't find the stories of North Africa by sitting on the sidelines. No one else will take you where we can in North Africa. And no one else will show you what it's all about. CGTN, see the difference.
An engineer in Nigeria's southeastern state of Anambra is now the talk of the town. He has managed to develop a hydroelectric generator which turns waste into petroleum products. He's hoping he could commercialize his innovation and create employment opportunities for young Nigerians. Here's CGTN's Brian Toussaint with his story.
An engineer by profession, Emeka Ugwuezi set up his mini technology lab in Awka. His latest invention, a water-powered generator prototype, has been the talk of the town in recent months. Powered by high-voltage motorcycle batteries with no carbon emissions, it can last over 6 hours depending on the energy consumption rates.
I actually lost a friend to a generator which actually brought about this, because I wanted to do something that kind of eliminate the use of gasoline generators in the society. So I'm actually an advocate of clean energy and waste management.
Trained in metallurgy at a technical college, he has set out to solve problems across the environmental, health, and industrial sectors. However, Emeka has to rely on donations to purchase the required components for his inventions.
I usually source my raw materials from waste bins. In fact, I go and get discarded electronic components. At some point, friends do a lot of donating. Like people, you see what I do, you just love what I create. They just, okay, take this, use it to get this at the end of the day. So as things grows on, they keep on happening that way, even from social media. People have not even known me tend to donate some money just to make sure that the dream doesn't die off.
Emeka has 12 innovations so far. He created this generator in 2001, and he has been progressively improving it. This particular invention has generated interest from across town due to the benefits that come with it.
People think that, even some actually tend to dispute that what I'm actually doing is not sustainable, or it doesn't work, or is a lie, I'm trying to connote something. But at the end of the day, you end up seeing that it's actually real. I'm not saying that we arrived there yet. It still has its own flaws.
It's very, very excellent. I'm even begging him to, sell for me, but he said that it's not possible now. I'm even waiting for any time that he has produced it going to the market. That is must. I must even purchase like 5 for myself and my family.
Most businesses and homes in Nigeria are forced to run on diesel or petrol-powered generators. It is estimated that around 80 million people do not have access to grid power supplies. Emeka hopes his invention could play a role in expunging the difficulties faced in Africa's most populated country. Brian Toussaint, CGTN.
Well, before we go, here's a quick look at how Africa's currencies performed today. Nigeria's naira, lifted by inflows from foreign investors who are seeking to buy central bank high-yielding treasury bills. It was quoted at around 361 to the dollar from the 363 it fetched on the over-the-counter market last week. Meanwhile, South Africa's rand erasing all gains today as the South African Reserve Bank cut the repo rate by 25 basis points for the first time since July. In Kenya, the shilling strengthening due to increased inflows from the agricultural sector and, of course, diaspora remittances. That's amid thin importer dollar demand on the market. Well, that's it for this edition of Global Business Africa. Remember, you can send your feedback to the contacts on your screen. You can also follow us on our various digital media platforms. From me, Uche Okoronkwo, and the rest of the team, thanks for watching.